Today we're looking at news from the Faroe Islands, straight from November 7th, 2024. So pretty recent stuff.
Hot off the presses.
We've got articles from Kringvarp Faroe in .fo and vp.fo.
A nice little mix. Gives us that broader perspective, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And honestly, there's a lot to unpack, but we're going to focus on what's really important,
Yeah.
what jumps out, you know?
Absolutely. And you know what's interesting?
What's that?
Even with these local sources, we see these global connections.
Yeah, like what?
Well, the U.S. election, for example, you wouldn't think it would be a big deal in the Faroes, but it's making headlines.
Yeah, I noticed that. There were quite a few articles talking about the U.S. election and, like possible economic impacts on the Faroes.
Right, and it makes sense when you think about it. The Faroes economy, like a big part of it relies on exports, especially in the fishing industry.
Right, right.
And one of the major companies there, Bakkafrost, they're like huge in salmon farming. By the way, they even came out and said they're like in wait and see mode.
Really?
Yeah, they're a little uncertain about, how U.S. trade policy could change and what that means for them. And for the Faroes economy as a whole, it's a big deal for them.
Makes sense.
It does, doesn't it?
And it's not just like speculation either. vp.fo had this report that some economists are even predicting job losses in Denmark because of like potential trade barriers.
Wow.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
said it could be like up to 30,000 jobs.
That's a lot.
It is. It really shows how interconnected everything is,
Yeah.
even on an island way out there.
It really does. It makes you think,
Yeah. Like how could a U.S. election affect, our lives?
Yeah.
Even indirectly,
Yeah. It's a good question to think about.
for sure. But okay, let's maybe switch gears a bit. There was a lot of talk about pensions. That seemed to be a hot topic.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. It seems like there's this proposal to raise the pension age.
To 70 by 2042, gradually, of course.
Right, right. Gradually. But still, it's, causing some debate.
Oh, absolutely. It's a sensitive topic. VP.fo even had this reader's letter that was really critical of the government and how they were handling it.
Yeah, that's understandable. I mean, retirement planning is a big deal everywhere, right?
Yeah.
But I imagine it's like even more sensitive in the Faroes.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, they have unique demographics. Like their population is aging like a lot of developed nations.
Oh.
And so it's like this balancing act. The government wants to make sure pensions are like sustainable in the long term, but they also need to invest in things like infrastructure to keep the islands going.
It's complicated.
Yeah, it's complex. Remember that article about the Famgen tunnel in VP.fo?
Bigly.
Well, it's going to cost almost 300 million kroners.
Wow, for a tunnel.
Yeah, and Famgen itself, its population is actually shrinking. So it's like, is this the best way to spend that money?
Nah.
It's a tricky situation.
Yeah, for sure. Well, maybe we can take a break from all this, like, serious stuff for a second.
Sure, little breather.
What about some of those more fun, quirky stories?
Mm.
The ones that give you a sense of, like, daily life in the Faroes.
I like those little snapshots,
Exactly. I saw this article about a new Faroes Bible app.
Oh, yeah, replacing the old one?
Yeah, exactly. Seems kind of small, but I thought it was cool. Like, they're keeping their language and traditions alive, even in this digital world.
I see that. And you know what else fits with that? That article in .fo with Lena Anderson, remember?
Not really reminded.
She asked this question, Du gir tu at Tosa Frost? Means, do you know how to speak Faroes?
Ah, right.
Yeah.
It's about, like, language preservation,
Mm.
which is huge, especially now with globalization and all that.
Absolutely. And you know what else got me thinking about cultural pride? The Faroes women's handball team.
Oh, yeah. They crushed it.
They did, against Kosovo, right?
Yeah, big win, 32-21. They're leading their EM qualifying group now, according to in.fo.
Hey, sorry, for those of us who don't follow handball, what's an EM qualifying group? It's basically like the first stage of the European Handball Championship. Teams compete to get into the main tournament.
Ah, okay, so they're in a good spot.
They're a really good spot to qualify.
And handball is, like, a big deal in the Faroe Islands.
Huge. People are super passionate about it. And when a Faroes team does well, like on the European stage, you can really feel that national pride.
It's about more than just the sport.
Exactly. It's about like national identity recognition, belonging to something bigger.
That's awesome.
It is, isn't it?
So, wow, we've already covered a lot in this first. We've talked about election worries, the pension debate, language, even a big handball win. It's amazing how much is going on in the Faroes, even though it's like a small place.
It really is. A lot packed into those islands.
It is. So before we move on to the next batch of news, I'm curious, what stood out to you so far? What's got you thinking?
Well, honestly, I'm struck by, it's fascinating, isn't it? How stuff happening across the world can really impact a place like the Faroe Islands.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
But let's zoom in a bit, get back to those local issues. Remember the Famjin tunnel we mentioned?
Yeah, vaguely. Remind me.
Well, funding for these big projects, it seems to be a recurring theme in the news.
Oh, right, yeah. And that tunnel is like a perfect example. VP.fo said it's going to cost almost 300 million kroner.
It is a hefty price tag.
That's a lot of money for a tunnel,
Yeah,
especially with like Famjin's population shrinking.
exactly. And it raises those questions, doesn't it, about whether it's really a good investment in the long run.
Hmm. Yeah, tough choices
The government's trying to walk this tightrope, you know,
between.
progress and reality. They need modern infrastructure, but with the population changing, the economy not always stable.
Mhm.
It's a balancing act.
Definitely. And it's not just about infrastructure, right?
Right. Healthcare, too.
Oh, yeah. Faroe mentioned something about a new health insurance bill. They're debating it in Parliament, right?
That's the one. It sparked this whole conversation about the future of healthcare in the Faroes.
Makes sense. Healthcare is always a big deal.
Always. But think about it, in a place like the Faroes, with their, geographical situation, limited resources.
Yeah, the challenges must be even bigger.
Absolutely. To provide good health care on these remote islands, it takes a lot of creativity and often some tough decisions.
It's complex.
It is.
So the Faroes government has a lot to handle right now, huh? The U.S. election fallout, pensions, infrastructure, healthcare,
Yeah, they've got their work cut out for them.
for sure.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can switch gears again, something a little less serious.
I'm all for it. Those quirky stories, they really bring a place to life.
Totally.
Yeah.
Speaking of quirky, did you see the thing about a truck losing rocks on the road?
Oh, in Dafo.
Yeah, that one. Just made me chuckle. It's like, even in the Faroes, life happens?
It does. It humanizes it somehow. Reminds you it's not just this picture-perfect postcard.
Exactly. Oh, and what about the trash can fires in Have?
Two of them.
I know, right? Fire department had to go out twice. Small incident, but it shows, like,
Yeah.
community safety is important, even for little things.
It does. You're right. Sometimes it's the little things that are news.
Yeah. And speaking of which, I saw a few articles about local businesses, initiatives. It's kind of nice to see that,
Yeah.
alongside all the other stuff.
It is. Little glimmers of growth, community stuff.
Like, in.fo reported that Bakkafrost is building a new well boat with KJ.
Big investment. Good for the fishing industry.
And VP.fo mentioned FK, the Faroes Purchasing Association, is merging with a Danish company.
Interesting. That cross-border stuff can bring new opportunities.
It's cool to see how they're navigating that, right? Being part of the global market, but keeping their own identity.
It's a tightrope walk. But they seem to be doing all right.
Yeah, for sure. All right, before we wrap up our Faroes news journey, I want to touch on one more thing. Arts and culture. There were a couple things that caught my eye.
I'm listening. Culture is what brings a place to life.
It does. Well, remember that new Faroes Bible app from VP.vo? I thought it was a cool example of like using technology to keep traditions going.
Oh, good point. And it kind of links back to that question, Dugir 2 at Tosa Fareist. Remember.
Yeah, do you know how to speak Faroes? From Lena Anderson's article in .4.
Exactly. It's all about language and identity.
Such an interesting question, especially for a place like the Faroes.
With their unique history, their own language.
Makes you wonder, right? How do you hold on to your culture while being part of the world?
A question a lot of places are facing these days.
They seem to be doing a good job of it, though.
They do. Finding that balance.
Yeah. So, wow, we've really covered a lot of ground in this Faroes News deep dive. From big global impacts to pension debates, even trash can fires and new well boats. It's been a good overview, I think.
A real mix.
And before we move on, I'm curious, what's resonating with you the most from all this info? Anything sticking in your mind?
Honestly, I'm struck by, yeah, it's impressive how much is happening in the Faroe Islands for such a small place.
I know, right? It's like they've got this energy dealing with all these like big issues, economic uncertainty, social welfare, but they still have this strong sense of community and their own culture.
They do. It's that resilience, I think.
Yeah.
Adapting to things, but not losing sight of who they are.
Totally. And speaking of keeping their identity, there were a couple more stories I wanted to mention.
Go for it.
Faroe had an article about like the search for a new director for the National Museum.
Yeah, big shoes to fill.
Right. Seems like a pretty important job.
It is. The National Museum, it's like the heart of their history and culture. And VP.fo said they had 4 applicants, so
Oh, wow.
yeah. Be interesting to see who gets it, who leads them into the future.
For sure.
Mm.
And speaking of the future, what about that Stella Polaris Festival?
Oh, right. VP.fo mentioned that, yeah. Coming up in March. Tickets are already on sale.
Wow, already.
Yeah, they sell out fast. It's this huge music and arts festival. Always draws a big crowd.
Sounds amazing. Anyone visiting the Faroes in the spring should definitely check it out.
Definitely. It's like a celebration of Faroe's talent. All that creativity.
Awesome. Well, as we wrap up our Faroes News deep dive, I have to say, I'm impressed. This little nation, they're taking on these challenges head on. They're innovative. They're holding on to their traditions.
It's inspiring, isn't it?
It is. And what strikes me is that balance they seem to have between like local stuff and global trends.
It's something to think about for sure.
Yeah, it is. So, as we say goodbye to the Faroe Islands for now, we leave you with this question. How can we, in our own lives, our own communities, find that same balance? How do we embrace the new while staying true to ourselves?
Keep exploring, keep those questions coming. Until next time.